They say there are rooms in history where even time refused to speak, where the walls were silk, but the air was iron, where candles flickered over satin sheets, and yet nothing felt warm. These were not bedrooms. They were altars, shrines to power, the place where empires planted their roots, not in soil, but in skin. And somewhere, behind a velvet curtain, the whisper still lingers. Long ago, before dawn had a name, a queen was led barefoot to a room she did not choose. Perfumed, hands adjusted her veil. She had been weighed, washed, judged, for the softness of her thighs, praised for her silence. The door closed. The ritual began. And history took another breath. Beneath the lace and gold, desire was never her own. She did not belong to her heart. She belonged to the crown. This is how empires made heirs, not with love, but with laws dressed as ceremony. The bed became a contract, its linens parchment, its stains proof. We remember kings for their wars, but we forget how they conquered flesh, how they chose their lovers like horses, bred for lineage, for purity, for politics. And the LWS, they were never written in ink. They were carved into skin. Boys were taken before their voices could deepen, their futures stolen with a blade, gilded, locked away, told their silence was holy. They guarded chambers they could never enter, bore witness to desire they would never feel. Their laughter vanished. Their manhood was not lost, it was sacrificed. And still, the silked curtains swayed, unmoved by the weight of centuries. Even pleasure was not free. It was timed, recorded, observed. In some courts, officials kept ledgers of every night a king spent inside another body. What time, how long, which partner, not for morality, but for control. Because in the architecture of empire, the bedroom was a fortress, and the body a gate. Desire had to obey. And yet, beneath all that order, something still trembled. A secret glance, a hidden bruise, a kiss stolen between ceremony and dusk. The human spirit has always found cracks in even the thickest stone. But this chapter, this room, is not about rebellion, it is about ritual. Because even the most grotesque customs can be cloaked in silk. Even the darkest laws can be whispered, like lullabies. And over time, those whispers become beliefs, and beliefs become tradition, and tradition becomes silence. And so the ritual continued, night after night, bride after bride, boy after boy. Until even the ghosts forgot their names. History tells us of battles fought on bloodied fields. But there were other wars, quieter, ones waged beneath sheets, sanctioned by crowns, disguised as destiny. And perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of all, not the suffering, but how beautifully it was hidden. So now we stand at the edge of this memory, listening not to facts, but to fabric, not to history books, but to the breath that still lingers on the velvet of the past. Because in every empire, the bed was a battlefield, and though the swords were soft, the wounds never healed. But tell me, when you lie down at night, when the lights are off and the quiet returns, whose laws still live in your skin, and whose voice still whispers beneath your sheets? They say that, in ancient courts, the bed was not for sleeping, it was a stage, a throne laid flat, a place where kingdoms whispered to themselves. In flesh, forget what you know of bedrooms. Forget the hush of pillows and the privacy of night. Here, in the royal bedchamber, nothing was private, nothing was free, not even the soul. That the sheets were ceremonial, the mattress observed. Desire did not wander. It was choreographed, like a slow, deliberate dance between power and proof. Byzantium, the wedding night did not end in silence, it ended in testimony. A bed inspected, a bloodstain praised. Witnesses bowed, not to the lovers, but to the evidence of their union. Proof of virtue, proof of submission, proof that the crown had extended its line. In the forbidden city, even turning over was not your own. The emperor's every gesture was logged, his body mapped like a sacred relic. If he turned to his left, 3 eunuchs wrote it down. If he called for a woman, the selection was recorded, sealed, filed. He may have been the dragon son of heaven, but even dragons must obey the calendar. Even kings have curfews when power sleeps and pattern. And in the Mughal harem, the doors were guarded by men without gender, watching over women without choice, not protectors, but witnesses. The body was a locked garden, and only one man held the key, but the rituals were older than the rulers, older than the palaces, older than the gods they swore by. Because when a woman lay down beside a king, she did not lay down her heart, she laid down a dynasty. Her hips were counted, her cycles timed, her silence revered. Virginity was not purity, it was border control. To enter without permission was not sin, It was war. The laws of the bed were never gentle. They wore silk but moved like swords. In some courts, breaking ritual meant exile. In others, it meant death. One misplaced touch, one uninvited lover, one child born from the wrong night, and the kingdom bled. So desire learned to hide. It learned to wait, to crawl between curtain folds, to whisper in dreams, to survive in glances never held too long, because beneath the structure, beneath the protocol, beneath the velvet weight of all that expectation was something still, breathing, the soul, the ache, the eternal longing that power could not legislate. And perhaps that is the tragedy of the royal bed, that love became a ledger, that desire became a law. Their bodies were not held but audited, and yet night after night they returned, the queens, the concubines, the eunuchs, and the emperors, each one performing a part in a drama too old to question. They stepped onto the stage, they lay in the throne, they slept, but they were never free. And now I ask you, if you could peel back the silk of history, just once, would you find a single moment where the heart was sovereign, or were the rules of the bed always stronger than the voice? Inside it, they say silk remembers everything, even when it is washed, pressed, perfumed, it holds the ghost of what it touched, a trace, a bruise, a prayer. And in the old courts of kings and gods, silk did more than dress the bed. It bore witness to blood, to law, to the invisible violence stitched beneath ceremony. In the candlelit silence of medieval Europe, the first night was not a secret. It was a spectacle, a ritual, a trial. The bed was prepared, white and waiting, a stage upon which innocence must die visibly, and the bride, trembling beneath 100 unspoken eyes, was not a woman yet. She was evidence, because virginity, in those lands, was not sacred. It was political, a seal, a signature written in the most fragile ink, blood. The morning after, the sheets would be held high, displayed, inspected, sometimes paraded through the square like a trophy from a hunt. But what if there was no blood? What if the skin did not break as expected, or had broken before from riding, from running, from simply being alive? Then there was silence, followed by whispers, followed by punishment, exile, annulment, or worse, a blade drawn not for justice, but for shame. The laws did not ask for love, they asked for proof. And proof, in the empire of purity, meant pain. Far from Europe, in the gilded shadows of the Ottoman world, the ritual was colder still. Girls, some too small to know the word for no, were examined before they were ever touched. Doctors, midwives, and mothers became gatekeepers of the crown. They inspected, prodded, declared, a girl's future decided not by dreams, but by the shape of her flesh. Some were kept, some were discarded. Some were trained to walk with downcast eyes, to speak only when asked, to breathe like whispers, soft enough not to disturb the weight of expectation. And yet, in all of it, silence reigned. The women did not speak. The men never asked. The courts never wept, because purity, like power, was a performance, and blood was its currency. It didn't matter that the hymen was a myth, that science would one day laugh at the brittle fiction of untouched flesh. What mattered was the theater, the drama, the crimson stain on white silk, the only language the empire trusted. It is strange, isn't it, that an entire civilization could balance so much on something so fragile, that kingdoms rose and fell on a stain, a whisper, a sheet left bare. Let us ask the older question, not how it happened, but why. Why was it easier to believe in blood than in the breath of a woman? Why was the silence of girls more sacred than their voices? Perhaps because silence cannot rebel. Perhaps because proof can be punished, but love cannot be controlled. And so they dressed it in perfume, they wrapped it in poetry, they called it virtue, honor, duty. But underneath the satin, underneath the incense, beneath all the folded linen, lies the silk was always stained, not just with blood, but with fear, with silence, with the weight of stories no one was allowed to tell. And now, across time, across empire, across every palace and prison disguised as love, we ask, if purity required pain to prove itself, was it ever pure at all? Or did we simply fall in love with the color red against a field of white? In the shadows of the palace, where the perfume of concubines curled like incense beneath carved ceilings and shuttered moons, there stood men who were no longer men, silent, shaved, shaped by absence. They were not kings, not lovers, not even rivals. They were watchers, half remembered and wholly forgotten. The eunuchs. Some were chosen, others were stolen, taken as boys from markets, from borders, from songs they never got to finish singing, and then cut. not just in flesh, but in memory. As if to erase the very possibility of desire, as if to say you may serve the flame but never feel its warmth. Their voices never broke, their faces stayed smooth. Time passed through them like wind through a hollow flute, yet they remembered everything. They guarded the harem, those silk-draped sanctuaries where queens and courtesans whispered beneath the weight of empire. The eunuchs walked between rooms like ghosts with keys, silent custodians of forbidden light, but while they held the door, they were never allowed to enter the realm of want, of touch, of being wanted. Desire was amputated, emotion anesthetized, and yet something stirred. A hunger not of the body but of being. To be seen, to be real, to exist beyond function, beyond title, beyond this haunting choreography of servitude. For some, it was survival. For others, a strange kind of power, a nearness to the throne that no general could reach. They whispered secrets, carried commands, watched queens cry in the dark, and knew more of empire than emperors ever could. But still, they could not feel. Or if they did, they were never allowed to say so. Theirs was the erasure beneath the gold, the ancient art of subtracting a soul until only duty remains. What empire could not control, it unmade. What it feared, it disfigured. Into loyalty. Not lovers, not rebels, not men. Just silence, just presence, just eyes that never closed. And so the vigil continued, night after night. They stood between desire and destruction, between what was wanted and what was forbidden, as guards, but as monuments to obedience, to sorrow, to the cost of order. The question is not why they were made. History always finds a reason. It invents logic to mask cruelty, poetry to drape over pain. No, the question is simpler. What becomes of a man who is never allowed to want? What grows in the hollow where longing should have lived? Perhaps it is wisdom, perhaps bitterness, perhaps nothing at all. But somewhere, in the silence of those moonlit halls, a pair of eyes still watch, not for danger, not for desire, but for a self that was never allowed to be. And we are left to wonder, what part of empire must be cut to keep it standing, and how many ghosts must hold the door so no one sees what's been lost inside. In a forgotten courtyard, where stone has crumbled and jasmine still climbs, a scroll lies half buried in dust. The ink has faded, the language almost lost, but the intention still lingers. Like perfume caught in the folds of an old robe, desire, once wild and wordless, was bound here to parchment, to position, to planetary rhythm. The ancients did not trust the randomness of want. They measured it, marked it, aligned it with stars and the tilt of the moon. In the courts of India, Ayurvedic sages whispered guidance to kings, teaching that a lover's touch could heal or poison depending on the hour, the season, the silence. Of the body, they spoke of days to abstain when the moon was dark, when omens soured, when Mars sat too close to the sun, and they spoke of nights when union was sacred, when the breath of two could awaken the divine. In China's golden palaces, the emperor's bed was not his own. It belonged to time, to heaven, to the calendar that governed not only harvests, but hearts. Physicians and astrologers advised who he should lie with, and when they believed certain women held longevity within their blood, and that their bodies touched at just the right moment, could extend a dynasty, or shorten a life. And so, love became calculation, lust, a ritual. The moment of union, a blend of sacred geometry and statecraft, not a whisper in the dark, but a decree, scheduled, stamped, filed among ledgers and ledgers of flesh-turned formula. There was magic in this, yes, a strange reverence, a belief that bodies were not just instruments of pleasure but vessels of consequence, that every sigh was a summons to the gods. But beneath the incense, a question lingers. What happens when desire is no longer born, but assigned, when the ache of longing is penciled into a court calendar? What becomes of touch, when it is weighed by omens, measured by moonlight, calculated like war? Perhaps it becomes something else, not less, but different. Not chaotic hunger, but sacred design, not a flame but a constellation. In these chambers, the body was an altar, the kiss, a ritual, orgasm, a prophecy whispered into silk. And in that alchemy, passion became religion, sex, scripture. But still, can mystery survive once it's mapped? Can longing remain holy when law lies beneath it? Or does something ancient begin to wither when every tremble is timed? Maybe this was never about lust at all. Maybe it was about power. Power over time, over fate, over the chaos of wanting. To tame the wildest thing in the palace, not the enemy, not the court, but the hunger inside a man. And so, they wrote rules, built rituals, set clocks against the soul, all in the hope that longing might obey. We walk now through those same gardens. The petals are gone, the scrolls unread, but somewhere a question still floats in the air, soft as breath, sharp as truth. Is love more sacred when ungoverned, or when obeyed? And was the truest seduction the one we never chose, but were told to feel? They called it blessing, but in the dark corridors of every palace, it felt more like a burden. The womb not as sanctuary, not as self, but as strategy. In candlelit halls hung with velvet and silence, the queen's breath was counted. Appetite measured her belly, not her soul, watched for signs of worth. She did not belong to herself, not truly. Her body was an empire's gamble, and the stakes were carved into flesh. In Tudor courts, a pregnant queen was never alone, not out of love, but fear. They feared the milk would sour, the food be laced, the air poisoned with envy or ambition. That's so they posted watchers at her bedside, not to comfort, to control. And in Persia, if her stomach swelled without the shape of a son, she was punished, not with scorn, but with starvation, as though hunger might frighten the wrong child back into the ether. Stillbirths were not deaths, they were diplomatic collapses. Treason wrapped in silence. Infertility, not a sorrow, but a sentence. A woman without heirs was not childless. She was useless. And yet, no law could force life. No priest or physician could will the blood to quicken. The alchemy of creation remained, stubbornly, sacred, even in a world that tried to legislate the stars. These were not just laws, they were rituals, ceremonies disguised as care. A cup of milk stirred 3 times, a certain color of bedding, the arrangement of pillows before sleep, superstition in silk gloves, control cloaked in devotion. And always beneath it fear, the fear that a woman might hold too much power or none at all, the fear that her silence might become a voice, that her body might choose itself. Because what does it mean when your womb belongs to a crown, when your pain is policy, when your joy is rationed to match the ambitions of men? She smiles in portraits, painted, perfected. But behind the brushstrokes, there are months of bleeding no one dared record. There are ghosts she was not allowed to grieve, daughters she was not allowed to name. And in the end, no one asked what she wanted, only what she carried. A queen's body was never truly hers. It was a corridor, a vault, a holy box in which kings placed their futures and locked the key. But when the halls were empty, and the watchers gone, and the silk curtains closed against the moon, did she ever press her hand to her stomach, not as a monarch, not as a consort, but as a woman, and whisper, "Do you belong to me, or to history?" There is an old tale of a lover who folded themselves into the hollow of a harp, their breath becoming music, so they could be carried into the chambers of the forbidden. No one remembers their name, only the melody, the haunting, trembling note of love that risked becoming ash just to touch skin, because no matter how thick the war, no matter how sharp the law, desire has always been a thief, and stone always cracks. They built empires with rules, stone upon stone, decree upon decree, gates, chambers, guards, silence. But hearts are older than palaces, and older still is longing. Behind the iron lattice of the forbidden city, beneath silken roofs and eunuch eyes, there were footsteps soft as breath slipping into the warmth of someone not permitted. In Mughal gardens, love letters were wrapped in petals and dropped into fountains, floating like secrets toward waiting hands. Some queens inked their desire with blood the court could not control, a crimson signature smuggled into scrolls. Others buried their lovers in plain sight. One entered a palace in a coffin, not dead, just desperate, smuggled in by devotion and buried alive in kisses. And yet, these were not just tales of passion, they were defiance wrapped in velvet, sacrilege, scented in jasmine, because to love without permission, to touch without decree, was not just scandal, it was rebellion, it was war. They could chain the body, but they never mastered the heart. Behind every forbidden affair was a truth the court could not unmake, that the soul is not loyal to lineage, it does not bow to duty. It slips through cracks, beneath doors, between shadows. They called them traitors, adulterers, fools. But love does not read laws, it reads breath, eyes, the space between fingertips hovering but not yet touching. And when they were caught, oh, the punishments were exquisite in cruelty. Tongues cut, eyes burned, bodies hung above the very walls they tried to slip through. But even then the stories survived, whispered through silk screens, etched into hidden walls, buried in the roots of gardens where lips once met in trembling dark. Because some love stories do not end with death, they end with memory, and memory cannot be ruled. Tonight perhaps, somewhere in a palace, long abandoned, Two shadows still meet behind a cracked mosaic, and if you lean close, if the night is soft enough, you might hear a breath, a name, a question that trembles like silk in the wind. What would you risk for one stolen touch? Each night she reached for it, and each morning the sun punished her with light, because some desires were never meant to be seen. There were empires that feared love more than they feared war, not love in name but in touch, in heat, and hunger ungoverned by decree, and so they built punishments not to stop it, but to humiliate it, to etch it into memory like a scar across silk. A queen who strayed, stripped bare, paraded past the statues that once guarded her name. A soldier who loved another man, his eyes burned so that he might never look again. Some lovers were bound and made to watch as the other disappeared into fire, or sword, or silence. There were no secrets, only spectacles. The bed became a stage. The crime, pleasure without permission. The sentence, pain as performance. But even then, desire refused to die, because when you strip a body, you do not shame it, you reveal the truth beneath the robe, and the people, even as they watched, did not forget the crime. They remembered the love. They whispered about the queen who smiled as she was led through the jeering crowd, the concubine who sang to herself as her lashes fell, the man who kissed his lover's bloodied hand before it was taken from him. They tried to erase these moments, but in doing so they carved them deeper. Pleasure became legend. Shame became poetry. There are ruins, still standing where these punishments once unfolded. Amphitheaters of cruelty, balconies built not for music, but for mourning. And if you sit there long enough, past midnight, past memory, you might still hear it, the breathless silence of a crowd watching a heart defy its empire. The cry that was not of pain, but of love unclothed and unrepentant. What they never understood was that you cannot legislate the soul. It curves too wildly, it touches too softly, it hides in places no law can reach. They thought public pain would kill private passion, but they were wrong. Desire, once shamed, becomes sacred, becomes myth, becomes ghost. And so we ask not with judgment, but with wonder, what kind of world must exist where to love wrongly is to be remembered forever? Once, in a palace of mirrors, they say a queen wept silently as her veil was fastened, not from sorrow, but because she knew this night was not hers, it was history's. The royal bedchamber, draped in velvet and guarded by silence, was never a place of rest. It was a contract written not in ink, but in expectation, in titles, in wounds, in whispers, passed through generations like debts unpaid. Here, the word love lost its meaning, folded into the language of treaties and heirs. It became ceremony, performance, a choreography of gazes and sighs. A queen might smile, but her smile was rehearsed. A prince might touch, but the touch was assigned. Even the sheets were not spared, inspected, recorded, sanctioned. Desire became something to be confirmed, not felt. And marriage, that softest of illusions, became a ledger. They said it was sacred, but it was strategic. They said it was union, but it was surveillance. And yet, in the flicker of candlelight, in the stolen breath before dawn, some learned to survive it. To tuck dreams into the folds of their robes, to touch without leaving evidence, to love not freely but fiercely, illegally. Others didn't survive. Some were lost inside the velvet, smothered by duty, by protocol, by the ache of being seen but never known. You might think the curtain has fallen, that the laws are gone, that the contract has crumbled with the thrones. But listen closely, and you will hear it, the rustle of modern scripts, echoing the old. Expectation has a new wardrobe now, but it walks the same halls. It decides who leads and who follows, who gives and who must not ask. We call it romance, we call it tradition, but sometimes it still feels like duty. There are lovers today who ask permission from ghosts, who carry rules in their bodies without knowing who wrote them, who perform when all they want is to rest in someone's ungoverned arms. So we arrive here, not in judgment, but in reflection. Not all contracts are signed. Some are whispered, some are inherited, some are stitched into the seams of bedsheet, and the pauses between I love you and I belong to you. And so we ask when we say love, do we mean freedom, or do we still mean law? They say some stages were never dismantled, that after the last line was spoken, the candles still burned, that somewhere behind velvet and time, the audience never left on in dreams. We return. To rooms laced with jasmine and silence, too cold, floors warmed by footsteps that no longer echo, to the hush of rules not spoken, but felt in the throat, a gesture too long, a glance too soon, a sigh that did not belong. The royal bedchamber is gone, but it lingers. not in stone, but in the shapes we make beside each other at night. The careful choreography of intimacy, the words we choose and the ones we don't. We like to think we are free, that the old laws died with the crowns. But somewhere beneath the skin something still kneels. There were once servants who watched from behind silk screens, eunuchs who never slept, walls that breathed with listening. Pleasure was permitted, but only when it performed. Now we live in quieter palaces, no guards, no scrolls, but still, the scent of protocol. We call it taste, we call it normal. But deep down, we know the curtain never really closed. Who told us what love should look like? Who measured our yearning with golden scales? Who taught us which touches are holy and which are shame? You see, the chandeliers may have dimmed, but the script still flickers, passed down in lullabies, in wedding vows, in the silence we inherit. Like rings, there are nights when the body remembers rules it never agreed to, when we reach for someone but hesitate, unsure if we are allowed. And there are mornings when we dress our longing in politeness, our ache in compromise, our truth in disguise. This is not a story of villains or of victims. It is a story of echoes of softness bent to fit the shape of history, of love rehearsed, then forgotten, then whispered again as if it were new. Even now, as you lie in your own room, the dust glows like incense in the dark, and the question rises, like a hush before the curtain falls again. When you lie beside someone whose law governs your love, whose hand wrote your longing, and whose ghost still lingers just out of view watching from the velvet,